Hi, and welcome back to the foundational content for the full stack development course. Today we're going to be discussing the UI component section of the UI systems design module. At the end of this module, you will have a good sense of how to break down problems in terms of their component design. This lesson is going to focus on component libraries and Storybook.js. Let's go ahead and get started. So here's what we hope to learn today. We want to be able to understand different ways to develop components and how they fit into UI systems generally. We want to understand the atomic design methodology and know how to classify UI elements. And then we want to learn and explore how to use tools like Storybook.js and understand the pros and cons of using Storybook as a tool. So let's contextualize this lesson within an interview question. Suppose you work at a company that has two websites with similar functionality, but different user groups, one for enterprise and another for retail. How can you develop a component-based design system to avoid duplicating development efforts? What tools would you use? What are some components that might make sense as a part of your design system? So let's talk about some design system considerations. When developing a UI system, there's a ton of different things to consider. For example, how many applications are you going to need? Maybe you need a retail, enterprise, or admin application that all shares a common design language. What platforms are you going to be supporting? Do you need native apps as well as websites and desktop clients? And how can you share code across the different applications or platforms? Is there a way you can write a component once and use it in all of those places? And also speed of development. Is it easy to iterate on shared components and it's not creating overhead that is going to slow down your development? So let's look at some potential solutions here. So say you needed to use a component in a single application. Well, then it probably makes sense to co-locate your component within that application. However, if multiple applications or multiple platforms need to share the same component, it may make sense to use a component library pattern. If you look at the two diagrams on the slide right now, you can see an example of each of these. One that co-locates their components and another that has two applications and shares some of their components within a component library. The means to share your component library can vary case by case, but typically it's done via NPM. So let's talk about component libraries a little bit more. The first question you might ask is, what goes in a component library? How do you know what to put in there? So technically speaking, anything can go in a component library, but you always want to be asking yourself the question, what components make the most sense to be shared? Because you don't want to share them simply for the sake of sharing. You actually want them to be useful. So the best way to think about this is in terms of composability. You want to start with small UI elements and kind of combine them together into more and more complex UI components. This is where the atomic design methodology comes in. Those small components that are really good to put in a component library are atoms, molecules, and organisms. Some of the more complex ones that are composed of atoms, molecules, and organisms are templates and pages. Those are the ones that typically are going to stay out of your component library and in your applications. Let's define a few of these different tiers of the atomic design methodology, just so that they're a little bit clearer to think about. So atoms is the smallest unit within the atomic design methodology. They would be things like text inputs and buttons. And then molecules would just be composed atoms. So maybe like a search form, which might include an icon, a text input, and maybe a button. Organisms are even slightly more complicated in that they're composed molecules. So maybe like a navigation bar that's going to be the same across multiple applications. That might include that search form. It might also include like a hamburger menu or something like that. Templates and pages, while they can go in the component library, oftentimes don't, because this is where you start to get complex enough that you don't necessarily want to share all this logic. It's less generically applicable across different applications, but you certainly can. So one common tool for component libraries or developing components in isolation is Storybook.js. It allows you to build small atomic components and compose them into more and more complex components or even complete pages. So let's take a look at Storybook.js a little closer and see, just so that you can get a sense of what it does. So here you can see how you can have a list of components on the left of Storybook, and whichever one you have selected will appear in the main section, and you can adjust different props and be able to essentially see your component in a bunch of different states very quickly. This can be really useful when you want to develop your components in isolation and then pull them into your various different applications. So you're still going to develop your components as you would normally. So like in this example, you develop your button component in its own file, but then you'd also have a Storybook file, which defines, it just lets Storybook know how to render that button that you've developed. So here you can see we have a button that we're pulling in, and we're simply rendering 3 different versions of it: a primary, secondary, and tertiary. Many different UI libraries will utilize Storybook as a way to illustrate the components that they offer and how you can use them as a developer. Let's take a look at React Strap's version of that to see how they do that. So over here we can see a list of all the different components that are available. We'll take a look at a badge just as an example. So here are the different stories that are defined. So you have badges that are links, badges that are pills, badges that are sizing, and keep in mind that this is all the same component. It's just got slightly different props. And here you can see in this documentation, you can actually see exactly how they're being invoked. So let's come back to this interview question. Suppose we work at a company that has 2 websites with similar functionality, but different user groups. How can we develop a component-based design system to avoid duplicating development efforts? Well, the easy answer here is we should use a component library. And what tools would we use? Well, Storybook seems like a good choice. It would allow us to develop our components in isolation and pull them into either one of these applications for either the retail or enterprise users. And in terms of what components might make sense as a part of our design system, well, that's kind of up to us. However, we always would want to start with the smallest and most composable UI components, or the atoms, if we're talking in terms of the atomic design methodology. So that's it for this lesson. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn about component libraries in Storybook. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.